Assalamu alaikum, brother and sisters. Today, we will explore in detail the difficult journey of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as he faced hostility and physical violence from the Quraysh during his early preaching in Mecca. This story is not just about the confrontations. It reflects the unwavering faith, patience, and dedication of the Prophet and his companions. The challenges they faced laid the foundation for the spread of Islam and serve as lessons for us today. In the early days of Islam, the Prophet received the command from Allah to preach openly, as described in Surah Al-Hijr, verses 94-99. This signaled the change from covert gatherings and private discussions of Islam to an outspoken proclamation of monotheism in a culture where idol worship predominated. The Meccans, especially the Quraysh tribe, were the keepers of the Kaaba and deeply invested in the idol-worshipping traditions that brought them not only spiritual comfort, but also economic benefits through pilgrimages. Therefore, when the Prophet climbed the hill of Abi Qubais to make his public declaration, he was challenging the very fabric of their society. When he called the Quraysh by name, they gathered in curiosity, not knowing that the message they were about to hear would shake the core of their beliefs. "If I were to tell you that an enemy was advancing on you from behind this hill, would you believe me?" he asked. They confirmed, "Yes, we would believe you, for you have never lied." The Prophet then warned them of a severe punishment if they continued in their ways of idol worship, declaring, "I am a warner to you before a severe punishment. Worship Allah alone and abandon your false gods." The air grew tense as the significance of his message sank in. Abu Lahab, the Prophet's uncle, exploded in anger. "May you perish! Is this why you gathered us?" he shouted, setting the tone for the Quraysh's opposition. The Prophet's declaration had just made a simple yet bold demand: the rejection of all idols and the acceptance of Allah's oneness. For the Quraysh, this was not just a matter of religious belief. It threatened their social status, tribal power, and economic wealth. In response to Abu Lahab's hostility, Allah revealed Surah Al-Masad, the palm fiber, which condemned Abu Lahab and his wife for their opposition to the message of Islam. This surah was a direct divine rebuke of Abu Lahab's actions and foretold his disgrace. This further enraged Abu Lahab, and his behavior grew more malicious. He and his wife Jamil began scattering thorns along the paths where the Prophet walked, hoping to inflict pain on him physically. Such acts of cruelty reflected the deepening hostility of the Quraysh towards Islam. Despite these provocations, the Prophet continued his mission with remarkable patience. Allah then commanded him in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verse 214, to warn his close relatives. In response, the Prophet gathered his family and openly declared his prophethood, calling them to worship the one true God. His uncles, including Abu Talib and Abu Lahab, were present. While Abu Talib continued to support his nephew, Abu Lahab's hatred only intensified. After this failed attempt to convince his family, the Prophet did not lose hope. He began preaching to the people of Mecca at every opportunity. His message was simple but profound: worship only Allah, the Creator, and abandon all idols. However, the majority of the Mexican elite refused to listen. They mocked the Prophet, calling him a madman, a poet, or a magician. But despite their insults, the Prophet remained focused on his mission, undeterred by their words. As the days passed, the number of Muslims grew, particularly among the oppressed and marginalized of Meccan society. The promise of equality before Allah, the emphasis on justice, and the notion of an afterlife where the righteous would be rewarded resonated deeply with slaves, the poor, and women. Early converts like Bilal ibn Rabah, Ammar ibn Yasir, and Sumayya bint Khayyat came from the ranks of the oppressed. These new Muslims endured unspeakable torment at the hands of their masters and the Quraysh leaders, who sought to force them to renounce their faith. Bilal, for example, was dragged across the scorching sands of the desert with a boulder on his chest. Yet he continuously chanted, "Ahad, Ahad, the One, the One." The Quraysh soon realized that the growing Muslim community posed a direct threat to their authority. They turned their attention to silencing the Prophet himself. One day, while the Prophet was praying near the Kaaba, the Quraysh placed the intestines of a slaughtered camel on his back. The Prophet, with his face to the ground in prostration, remained patient. His daughter, Fatima, may Allah be pleased with her, rushed to his side, weeping as she removed the filth. The Prophet comforted her, saying, "Do not weep, my daughter. Allah will protect your father." Such incidents were not isolated. They occurred regularly as the Quraysh intensified their efforts to humiliate and harm the Prophet. Despite their hostility, the Prophet continued to deliver his message in public spaces, often near the Kaaba. His preaching angered the Quraysh elites, as it challenged their social structure, religious beliefs, and economic interests. To counter him, the Quraysh resorted to verbal abuse and physical violence. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, a young shepherd who had embraced Islam early on, committed one of the most courageous acts of defiance. He decided to recite the Quran publicly near the Kaaba. Climbing a high rock, he began reciting Surah Ar-Rahman in a loud, clear voice. The beauty of the verses captured the people, but the Quraysh, outraged by his audacity, pounced on him, beating him severely. Despite his injuries, Abdullah continued until he had finished reciting. The Prophet himself was not spared from physical attacks. One of the most intense confrontations took place when the Prophet was performing tawaf around the Kaaba. A group of Quraysh men approached him, hurling insults. Then, without warning, they attacked him. Though the Prophet resisted, the attackers overpowered him. His daughter, Fatima, rushed to his aid, screaming for help. Some of the Prophet's companions, including Abu Bakr, ran to defend him, but they too were assaulted. Abu Bakr was beaten so severely that he was left unconscious, his face covered in blood. When he finally regained consciousness, his first words were, "How is the Prophet? Is he safe?" Despite his own suffering, his concern for the Prophet demonstrated the depth of his faith and loyalty. The Quraysh were aware that their hands were tied when it came to harming the Prophet directly. His uncle, Abu Talib, held a position of respect and influence in Mecca, and his protection of the Prophet prevented the Quraysh from inflicting serious harm on him. However, they did not stop trying to convince Abu Talib to withdraw his support. They offered him wealth, power, and alliances, but Abu Talib refused. In one instance, he said to the Prophet, "My nephew, do as you wish. I will never surrender you to them." Despite this protection, the situation remained tense. The Quraysh continued to plot against the Prophet. They approached Abu Talib again, offering to exchange a young, handsome man for the Prophet. Abu Talib responded with disdain, pointing out the absurdity of their proposal. "How could you give me your son to raise while you take mine to kill?" he retorted. Realizing that Abu Talib would not betray his nephew, the Quraysh grew more desperate and hostile. The Quraysh turned to a campaign of slander and frustration over their inability to silence the Prophet. They called him a magician, a poet, and a madman. They spread rumors that his words were nothing but spells meant to deceive and bewitch the people. One of the most significant events during this period was the attempt by Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, one of the most respected elders of the Quraysh, to confront the Prophet. He approached the Prophet with offers of wealth, power, and marriage if he would abandon his message. In response, the Prophet recited verses from Surah Fusilat. The beauty, power, and eloquence of the Quran stunned Al-Walid, leaving him speechless. Returning to the Quraysh, Al-Walid admitted that the words of the Quran were unlike any poetry or magic he had ever heard. Yet, in his arrogance and pride, he suggested that the Quraysh label the Prophet as a magician, claiming that his words possessed a mysterious power over people's minds. This marked the beginning of an organized effort to discredit the Prophet publicly. The Quraysh leaders stood near the Kaaba, warning people not to listen to the Prophet, declaring that he was a sorcerer who used enchanting words to lead people astray. They described the Quran as mere fabrications and myths of the past. These slanderous campaigns became more intense, especially during the times when pilgrims visited Mecca. The Quraysh wanted to ensure that no one from outside the city would listen to the Prophet's message. They feared that if people heard the words of the Quran, they would be captivated, just as many of the lower-class Muslims had been. Despite the Quraysh's efforts, the Prophet continued his mission with unwavering determination. He would recite the Quran near the Kaaba, engage with people individually, and hold secret gatherings in the house of Al-Arqam, where he taught his followers the principles of Islam. These secret meetings were essential for the early Muslim community, allowing them to learn and strengthen their faith away from the eyes of the hostile Quraysh. The opposition soon escalated from verbal abuse and slander to direct physical violence. When the Quraysh encircled the Prophet while he was performing tawaf, it was one of the most terrifying moments. With hatred in their eyes, they hurled insults at him, mocking his message. Without warning, they lunged at him, pushing and striking him. The Prophet did his best to defend himself, but he was outnumbered. His companions were not present at that moment, so he faced the assault alone. As the Prophet was being attacked, a passerby recognized what was happening and rushed to inform his companions. Fatima, may Allah be pleased with her, his young daughter, hearing the news, ran to her father's aid. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to shield him with her small frame. It was a heartbreaking scene. Muslims, the beloved daughter of the Prophet, watching her father being brutalized by the Quraysh. Nearby, one of the Prophet's closest companions, Abu Bakr, was alerted to the commotion. Without hesitation, he ran towards the Kaaba and threw himself into the fray, using his own body to protect the Prophet. The Quraysh turned their fury on Abu Bakr, striking him with such ferocity that he fell to the ground, blood streaming from his face. Despite his injuries, Abu Bakr continued to shout, "Will you kill a man who says, 'My Lord is Allah'?" His words echoed in the square, momentarily silencing the attackers. The beating was so severe that Abu Bakr lost consciousness. His companions carried him to his house, fearing for his life. When he finally regained consciousness, the first question he asked was, "How is the Prophet?" He refused to eat, drink, or rest until he was taken to see the Prophet and confirmed that he was safe. His mother and other family members tried to comfort him, but his concern was solely for the well-being of the Prophet. Such was the depth of Abu Bakr's faith and love for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Quraysh were not content with just attacking the Prophet. They extended their cruelty to his followers as well. The early Muslims, especially those who were poor or slaves, faced brutal torture at the hands of the Quraysh. The family of Yasir, including his wife Sumayya and son Ammar, were subjected to severe persecution. They were dragged into the hot desert sands and forced to lie under the scorching sun. Sumayya, in particular, suffered greatly. Despite her frail condition, she refused to renounce Islam, even as Abu Jahl, one of the fiercest enemies of the Prophet, insulted and abused her. In a fit of rage, he drove a spear through her body, making Sumayya the first martyr in Islam. Bilal ibn Rabah, a slave who had embraced Islam, was also tormented relentlessly. His master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, tied him up and dragged him across the burning desert, placing a heavy stone on his chest to crush him. "Renounce your faith," his master demanded. Yet with every ounce of his strength, Bilal only uttered, "Ahad, Ahad, the One, the One." His resilience became a symbol of the strength of the early Muslims. Abu Bakr eventually purchased Bilal's freedom, securing his release from the torture. But the memory of his suffering left a lasting impression on the Muslim community. The Quraysh used every means at their disposal to suppress Islam. They imposed social boycotts, ostracizing the Prophet's clan, Banu Hashim, and prohibiting any trade or interaction with them. This boycott lasted for 3 years, during which time the Muslims and their supporters suffered extreme hunger and hardship. They were forced to eat leaves and scraps to survive. The conditions were so dire that the cries of hungry children could be heard throughout the valley where they were confined. Throughout these trials, the Prophet had the unwavering support of his uncle, Abu Talib. Though Abu Talib did not accept Islam, he deeply loved his nephew and used his influence to protect him from the worst of the Quraysh's violence. The Quraysh understood that as long as Abu Talib was alive, they could not directly harm the Prophet without facing the wrath of his clan. However, the situation took a tragic turn when Abu Talib fell gravely ill. On his deathbed, the Prophet visited him and pleaded with him to accept Islam. "Say, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, and I will intercede for you before Allah," he urged. But the Quraysh leaders, including Abu Jahl, were also present, pressuring Abu Talib to remain loyal to the religion of their forefathers. In the end, Abu Talib chose to remain on the path of his ancestors, and he passed away without embracing Islam. This was a moment of deep sorrow for the Prophet, not only because he lost a beloved uncle, but also because he could not save him from disbelief. The death of Abu Talib marked a dark period for the Muslim community. With the loss of their protector, the Quraysh felt empowered to escalate their persecution. They began to physically attack the Prophet more frequently, without fear of retaliation. One day, as the Prophet was praying in front of the Kaaba, the Quraysh approached him, hurling insults and mocking his message. They surrounded him, pushing and striking him. Despite the blows, the Prophet remained calm, showing remarkable restraint and patience. In one instance, the Quraysh men made a conscious decision to openly attack the Prophet because of their hatred. As he walked near the Kaaba, they converged on him, beating him with such force that he fell to the ground. His daughter Fatima witnessed this brutal assault. Crying out in distress, she ran to protect her father, throwing herself over him to shield him from further blows. The Quraysh hesitated for a moment, shocked by her bravery, but then resumed their attack. Fatima's cries for help echoed through the square, drawing the attention of the Muslims who rushed to the scene. Abu Bakr, though still weak from his previous injuries, ran towards the chaos, shouting, "Will you kill a man who says, 'My Lord is Allah'?" The Quraysh, recognizing the potential backlash from harming Fatima or killing the Prophet outright, eventually retreated, but not before leaving the Prophet bloodied and bruised. This incident was a testament to the extreme cruelty of the Quraysh and the immense fortitude of the Prophet and his family. Despite facing repeated physical violence, the Prophet continued to call his people to the path of Islam. His endurance in the face of such adversity was not just a personal struggle, it was a demonstration of the strength of his faith and his commitment to the mission Allah had entrusted to him. These accounts of physical confrontations, verbal assaults, and relentless opposition highlight the incredible challenges faced by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions. They endured physical pain, humiliation, and the loss of loved ones for the sake of their faith. The early years of Islam in Mecca were a period of immense hardship, but they also laid the groundwork for the future strength and expansion of the Muslim community. The stories of the Prophet's encounters with the Quraysh serve as powerful reminders of the importance of patience, resilience, and unwavering faith in the face of adversity. His response to violence with peace, his persistence in the face of rejection, and his concern for the well-being of his followers offer valuable lessons for all Muslims. Despite the persecution, the message of Islam continued to spread, and the efforts of the Prophet and his companions eventually led to the establishment of a just and prosperous Muslim society. May we all draw inspiration from their sacrifices and strive to uphold the values they fought so hard to establish. Wallahu a'lam.